Hello, Martin Wagner. You're from Earthjustice. Could you let me know why you're here at the COP?
Well, I'm here because our organization is about environmental protection and the human right to a healthy environment, and climate change is all about both of those things.
Particularly at the moment, why do you feel that human rights are being jeopardized?
Well, climate change jeopardizes human rights in many, many ways. Every impact of climate change affects human beings. Not every impact is a human rights violation, but the extent of climate change impacts on humans is drastically undermining human rights. So that when climate change affects the ability of individuals or communities to survive, to find food for themselves, to be healthy, to have fresh water, all of those kinds of impacts violate human rights.
And what kind of mechanisms should be there to protect them?
Well, we have mechanisms in international law for protecting human rights. And one of the reasons it's important to bring a connection with the climate negotiations is that the climate regime is very technical. It's about dealing with the reduction of emissions, but the human impacts are not really addressed through the UN climate regime very well.
Adaptation, though?
Well, it's not just about adaptation. It's about how much governments have to do and which governments have to take the most action on mitigation. It's also what governments are most responsible for providing adaptation assistance and how much adaptation assistance. And I guess third, I would say that it's also about making sure that the solutions to climate change don't violate human rights themselves. And so it's bringing the human element into the solutions and making sure that the solutions are intended both to protect human rights but also not themselves to violate human rights.
Can you foresee a time when either on a state level or I'm not sure exactly, but that people could start facing litigation?
For human rights violations?
In terms of climate change.
In terms of climate change. We already have cases where there is litigation on behalf of individuals who are harmed by climate change. When we talk about human rights, I absolutely can foresee a time. I think we're still a little bit away from that. We have international institutions that are working with human rights, and we have international institutions, primarily the UNFCCC, that's working with climate change, and those two haven't been talking together very well yet. The Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights has done some study of the relationship between climate change and human rights, but the institutions that are responsible internationally for defending human rights and for hearing those kinds of claims that you're suggesting are still struggling with exactly how they're going to do that. But I think that as they look at these claims, that they are going to recognize that there is absolutely no question that in some circumstances the impacts on human beings of climate change undermine their rights greatly enough that there is a human rights violation. And they're going to have to address that and address the fact that there are a handful of governments that are primarily responsible for that.
Can you see a way that these institutions can work better together as more and more claims are going to be put forward?
Well, I think absolutely. I think it's important that the international human rights institutions be present at these negotiations, that they provide their input, and perhaps more importantly, that they provide their sort of moral sense here, because one of the important things that human rights does is it shows us, it brings to a legal level what we all know is morally true, which is that climate change is a human catastrophe. But just saying it's a human catastrophe doesn't give it the weight to sort of bring it in an equal way into these kinds of negotiations. And so when you start to talk about the fact that there are human rights at issue, and those are rights that are well established, are recognized as existing, as creating obligations for nations, then you can say, well, this moral problem is also a legal problem, and that means it creates legal obligations and legal responsibilities for governments. And as soon as you have that truth, then you have to begin taking it into account in the legal structures you're putting together to deal with climate change, which is part of what we're advocating here, is that human rights needs to be brought in, that connection needs to be brought into these agreements.
Much like people are being sued for wars years on, or being asked to make apologies for criminal acts committed 50 years ago, do you see that happening then?
I suppose it's possible. I think that what needs to happen right now, the first step is using human rights to make sure that there is current action that is adequate. So, for example, when governments can't put together enough of a commitment to reduce emissions to even begin to minimize the impacts on human beings and human rights, that is an instance in which they are not meeting their human rights obligations. And so let's start with here and now and say that their human rights obligations require them under international law to make serious and meaningful commitments that can have a chance even at avoiding unnecessary violations of human rights.
There's a certain irony to an American saying that, is there not?
Well, I'm not representing the government of the United States.
No, of course not. But you can you be sensitive to the issues. I mean, it's very nice to say that. But
no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the United States is the government that is the most responsible for the current suffering and human rights violations that are resulting from climate change. When we have communities in mountain areas like the Andes that are looking at losing all of their freshwater resources because glaciers that they depend on during the dry season are melting and are likely to disappear in 20 or 30 or 40 years, that melting is primarily the responsibility of the United States. And so the United States certainly is at the forefront of governments that have a legal obligation because of human rights responsibilities and commitments to step up and take serious action on mitigation and to take serious action on adaptation and finance.
Okay, so here's a number one question, the killer question. How do you enforce that legal obligation? You cannot put a country in jail.
You can't put a country in jail, and that's one of the weaknesses, some would say, of of almost all of international law, but certainly of the international human rights regimes. On the other hand, international human rights carry I think, like I said earlier, a moral weight that other kinds of law don't carry. And just because you can't be thrown in jail if you're found to be violating international human right or an international law doesn't mean that you're not guilty of that violation. And that can give other governments and people a certain authority to call on you to take action. And governments do try to avoid being recognized as human rights violators. That doesn't mean that they always do the right thing. It doesn't mean they always do what an international human rights institution tells them to do, but it creates a certain moral and legal pressure that affects governments.
So what are you advocating then for the countries that don't kind of toe the line in Cancun? What would be the next step?
Well, I think the first step here in Cancun is for the governments to recognize in the agreement that they're negotiating the human rights consequences of climate change and the fact that there needs to be a connection. So in text, even up as recently as a few months ago, there were clear recognitions. There was language that recognized that the United Nations Human Rights Council had recognized a connection between human rights and climate change. There were other places where it was stated that the governments will ensure that human rights are protected as they go forward with these different steps to protect human or to address climate change. That's the step number one. We need to get that language in because that will help the human rights institutions both as they're providing their own pressure on climate, but also as they're creating an avenue for affected individuals to raise their rights. It'll help to make that connection and allow those advances to happen. after that, I think the question is, as I said earlier, how they step up to their obligations, what they do. If you have the United States, you have all of the developed countries who need to make better pledges. They need to be not shooting for 2 degrees. They need to be shooting for something lower than 2 degrees, like 1.5 degrees, because 2 degrees is effectively, it's devastating, particularly in Africa, but in other countries as well, in other communities.
Okay, so where that leaves us right now is that countries really need to think about the future in terms of what might happen, what they might be held accountable for. We're not going to see any legal action in the short term. It is a pipe dream.
I don't think the immediate point is about legal action. I think the point is to first of all recognize that connection. It's almost like saying, look, particularly for a country like the United States, but there are a lot of countries that fall in this category. You talk a lot about the importance of protecting human rights. Well, stand up and face that what's going on with climate change is affecting human rights, that people's ability to enjoy these fundamental rights that we recognize as the most basic thing that is required for human survival on this planet, that those are being affected by climate change. Recognize that, and then stand up and tell us what you're going to do to address it. I think the question of sort of litigation, as you're asking, might be more important as we go forward. So if there are, for example, in a RED system where there are new incentives created to protect forests, and you have individuals and communities that depend on forests for their livelihood, well, let's make sure that we're not violating their rights because we've created a new, essentially, economic value in forests. And if we're threatening that, then we have human rights institutions and mechanisms that can step up, that those people can go to, and those mechanisms can say to the United Nations climate regime, look, wait, you've got to slow down here, you've got to do this differently.
As you were saying earlier, these institutions have to work much better together.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.